Great, fantastic. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you all here and very impressed that 89 and counting of you wanted to spend your Friday on a behavioral science webinar talking about meetings. So excited that we have at least about 100 folks who are as nerdy as we are. So this is today's Irrational Labs event. This is one of our open events, which is open to all. And we're really excited to have all of you here. We host many events for Irrational Labs members as well. Later in July, we'll be hosting an event on how to do a product teardown with one of Irrational Labs' own behavioral scientists, Monica Zhang. We'll be hosting some open office hours with a behavioral scientist at Irrational Labs. And we'll be hosting a talk on the psychology of risky decisions with Irrational Labs behavioral scientist, Dr. Lisa Zaval. So if you want more information about how to sign up for those Irrational Labs members only events, we'll be posting the link to the Irrational Labs newsletter in the chat later on. And so you'll be able to sign up for those exciting events as well. But for today's event, we are incredibly lucky to welcome the team from MITRE to talk to you about product design with psychology in mind, and specifically how they have used insights from design and behavioral science to design a really cool platform to help people conduct better meetings, because we have all been in a terrible meeting or 100, and we're excited to hear their insights about how to make meetings better. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers today and then hand over to them to give us all of their fantastic insights. So I'll start out by introducing CEO Dave Feldman. Dave Feldman has led teams at Google, Gmail, Facebook Messenger, and Yahoo. He also co-founded an app called Emu, which is a smart messaging app, which has been acquired by Google. Well done. Dave holds a computer science degree from Harvard. And quick note here, I've been told to say that he still somehow runs a good meeting, even without so congratulations. And then we also have Damian Wasensky. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Damian. Damian has built a career around meeting with people. So he's built multiple sales practices at early stage startups and previously worked at LinkedIn. He holds a mathematics degree, also from Harvard, bunch of nerds in the room today, and an MBA from MIT Sloan. And then we're also really excited to welcome Dr. Ashley Williams, who is an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School and an advisor to MITRE, and a friend of Irrational Labs, by the way. So her research focuses on the links between time, money, and happiness, probably three of the most important things in her lives. And she's the author of a book called Time Smart: How to Reclaim Your Time and Live a Happier Life. Dr. Williams is an expert on time management, and she would not schedule a meeting that could have been an email. So you all can feel very lucky that this particular meeting is worth your time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the MITRE team to give their fantastic talk to us. We are going to be saving the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So at the end, we'll ask you to raise your hand, come off mute, and ask your question to the team. So welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I believe you should be able to see our slide now. Excellent. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's flattering. I'm Dave. Of the three of those introductions, that's me. So yeah, here's a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'll start with a quick trip through the history of product design and its relationship to psychology. Ashley will get into the psychology of bad meetings, which is the problem we're trying to solve here at MITRE. Then I'll talk about the psychological and behavioral techniques we're bringing to bear on that problem in our product. And then Damian will tell you about the go-to-market side of that and why it turns out to be inseparable from the product design. And of course, we'll have that time at the end for Q&A. So yeah, let's get started. So I've spent much of my career doing this thing here for a living. All of the terms on this slide are names for the thing that I do in roughly chronological order. And sometimes I get cranky about all of these terms because this thing I do is all about building stuff that makes sense to people. And here we have all these different terms for it, and some of them have changed meaning over time, which doesn't help with it making sense to people. I bring this up so you know when I talk about product design today, this is what I'm talking about. And to be fair, as the name has changed over time, the role has changed too. It's always been about how people and technology relate to one another, but the nature of that relationship and of our understanding of it has evolved. So if we go back to the earliest days of personal computing, a lot of what product designers thought about was physical and mechanical, like how do we make a device that people can hold in their hand and use to achieve pixel level precision pointing at things on a screen, that sort of thing. And then as time went on, we figured a lot of that stuff out. But in the meantime, more and more people were using computers in more areas of their lives, and more of them were expecting to be able to do so without reading a manual or taking a class. And software was getting more and more complicated at the same time. So product designers had to focus on making things make sense to people. And we started to think about things like mental models and user expectations and how the human brain worked in ways that weren't how a computer did, and how we mediated between those things. And in the early days, we built a whole bunch of useful stuff like spreadsheets and docs and email. And now we were trying to build a whole bunch of new things. And actually, some of them didn't have clear use cases, or they were solutions in search of a problem. And so product designers had to think about how people interacted with the world, including people whose backgrounds and experiences were different from their own, and what their needs and desires were, and how those things might or might not relate to whatever it was they were building. And as tech turned into bigger and bigger business, we had to think about actually making money and competing. So we had to think about how to convince or entice people to use our products and to keep using them. And whoa, now we start to get into ethical questions, because habit forming, when is it okay to intentionally design things that are addictive? But that's not the topic for today. So let's reframe it a little bit. In the early days, and even a lot of the time today, designers think about optimizing workflows, taking people's existing tasks and making them easier, more efficient. Except it turns out everything we do is also about influencing people. People are more likely to click the bigger button, to look at faces, to make the choice we encourage them to make, whether we did that intentionally or not. And all that stuff we think about when we think about encouraging habit formation, making our products viral, driving engagement, that's wielding our influence in support of the business. So what if we take that influence and wield it on behalf of the user? What if we move beyond optimizing workflows and help people think and act differently? Can we build products that change people's behavior in ways that are positive and meaningful for them? That's what we set out to do with MITRE. And we knew from day one that the discipline of behavioral science would be a big part of getting there. So quick word on what MITRE actually is. We started with a simple premise. Everybody hates meetings. Most meetings suck. And it doesn't have to be that way. Our perspective was born of the outrage and frustration of 25 years in the working world, sitting in meetings that just felt like a waste of time at best. And at worst, were venues for all of the most unprofessional professional behaviors. It was also born of the conviction that there's a better way. Because in those 25 years, as we just covered, we'd been in some really good meetings that felt like productive, collaborative time, meetings that left us energized. Hell, we'd even run a few good meetings and seen how grateful everyone else was when we did. And we knew from day one that the big challenge would be changing behavior. And then the more we dug in, the more we realized the magnitude of that challenge, the degree to which we'd be changing not just behavior, but whole mental models. Here's what I mean by that. There's a lot of advice out there about what's wrong with meetings and how to fix them. They need an agenda. They need a timekeeper. They should be as short as possible. Maybe there should be a pre-read. And a lot of those things make intuitive sense. But as is so often the case when we get into human behavior, common sense kind of diverges from the truth. To uncover that truth, we've been lucky enough to have Dr. Ashley Whillans of Harvard Business School as our behavioral science advisor. She knows way more than we do, so I'm going to step aside and let her explain.
Thanks, Dave. So why do people attempt to fix meetings the wrong way, and how can we begin to build technology to help change this? The problem of meetings and the solutions for making meetings better, as Dave was already saying, are rooted in an understanding of psychology and behavioral science. Before I delve into the underlying psychology of bad meetings and using psychology and behavioral science to improve meetings, I want to take a step back and ask the question of why organizations should care about meetings in the first place. Well, organizations should care about improving meetings because meetings are a major source of time poverty in organizations. I define time poverty as the subjective feeling of having too many things to do in a day and not enough time in the day to do them. And 80% of working adults worldwide report feeling time poor. Time poverty matters for organizations because employees are happier and less likely to quit when they feel like their companies care about protecting their time. And organizations have tools at their disposal for reducing time poverty because their organizational practices often cause it. So one strategy that organizations can take to promote time affluence is to help their employees better manage digital distractions like meetings and email. Alleviating time poverty in organizations has never been more important than it is now. As my own research has shown, time poverty driven by digital distraction and additional chores and childcare is on the rise due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the changing nature of work. Research from Stanford shows that meetings are up 250% today as compared to pre-pandemic levels. And data from Microsoft shows that 30% of knowledge workers are now working a third shift between the hours of 7 to 10 p.m. to make up for lost time during the workday. So it's no wonder that employees rate meetings as the #1 productivity killer in organizations. As a result, meetings are the perfect place to start cultivating time affluence among employees. So this research moves us back to the question that drives MITRE. How can we design technology to make meetings better? Or to reframe this question in the language of my research, how can technology help make meetings a time saver instead of a time waster? To begin to address and understand this question, it's helpful to recognize that meetings involve numerous interrelated decisions. Before the meeting, we have to decide who should attend and plan for what we're going to do at the meeting. Or if we're not the meeting leader, we have to decide whether we should attend the meeting in the first place. During the meeting, we have to actually have the meeting and try to solve whatever goal we set out to achieve during the meeting in the first place. And after the meeting, we have to communicate about the meeting to relevant stakeholders and take next steps. As we'll discuss, psychological factors play a role in each step of the process of meetings. And we've designed MITRE to make each step of the process more productive and enjoyable, or at the very least, less frustrating. So MITRE's design was informed by myths, as Dave was mentioning, that people often hold about what they believe they need to do to run a good meeting. I'm going to focus on the psychology behind 3 myths that have most informed the product design elements we'll be talking about today, which are bolded on this slide. I like this myth because I often find myself with not enough time to get all of the things done I need to do because I feel compelled to be in every single meeting that I get invited to. And indeed, one of the most common reasons that meetings feel like or are productivity killers is because we attend too many of them and we invite too many people to attend our own meetings. Now, we do this because of FOMO, or the fear of missing out. As meeting participants, we worry that our colleagues will judge us or forget about us if we don't accept every meeting invitation. These fears are even higher in virtual and hybrid models of work, where it's harder to spontaneously run into our colleagues or our managers on a regular basis. Deeply ingrained beliefs about what it means to be an ideal worker also lead employees and managers to equate presence with productivity. So this is why our behaviors around meetings are often guided by these ideal worker norms. Our FOMO is substantiated, unfortunately, when our bosses use FaceTime as a proxy for commitment or fail to represent absent employees' opinions at meetings. In the US, we also give high status to people who seem like they never have a spare moment. And as a result, we internalize these beliefs and pack our schedules full to feel important and valued in our organizations. We also attend too many meetings because we like to maximize measured mediums or otherwise engage in behaviors with quantifiable outcomes like calorie counting, maximizing credit card points, or tracking hours worked because it makes us feel productive. So as a result, we often end up with too many meetings in our calendar because meetings are trackable, and attendance gives us an often inflated sense of having accomplished something meaningful. Well, MITRE doesn't directly intervene on prescribing who should attend meetings. The product helps to lower the perceived and actual costs of missing a meeting by providing detailed summaries. So the product feature of detailed summaries, which Dave will talk about more later on in the presentation, allows employees to be seen as a good worker even if they miss a meeting, because they'll have enough context, enough detail to provide their colleagues with feedback after the fact. Most importantly, detailed summaries help people feel like they can say no to meetings that aren't relevant and still receive the pertinent information that they need to do their jobs. Another meeting myth that we spend a lot of time trying to bust is the deeply ingrained belief that agendas are necessary and sufficient for running a successful meeting. Again, maximizing measured mediums plays a role in this belief by prompting us to think that a bulleted and timed agenda will automatically produce a successful meeting. We argue, and Dave will expand on this point later, that having a detailed agenda can create a false sense of preparation. This is related to the concept of effort bias. Putting in effort can make us feel like we made more valuable progress than we actually did. As a result of effort bias, meeting leaders might incorrectly believe that just because they have a timed agenda, their meeting will go great. We call this over-reliance on detailed agendas agenda theater. MITRE tries to move people away from creating a play-by-play of when a topic is going to be discussed in a meeting and for how long, to instead focus on why a topic is being discussed and what exactly needs to happen during a meeting to achieve the goal of the meeting. This way, the meeting is actually productive when it happens. The last myth is the idea that we need to record everything, or that recording everything will automatically create a sense of alignment on a team. So sometimes when a meeting ends, we forget it ever happened. And this often results in corporate purgatory, where we have the same bad meeting over and over. Our fear of meeting amnesia prompts many of us, myself included, I have done this, to create word-for-word transcripts and recordings of our most important meetings. So we become really focused on recording everything, as opposed to recording the most important takeaways or what was meant from the meeting. As an example of this, in one of my projects, we noticed that virtual work allowed junior employees to attend more meetings with senior colleagues and clients, either because they could dial into meetings that they would have never otherwise been a part of, or because the meetings were recorded and then shared internally later. At first, my research team and I thought that it was an amazing benefit of virtual work that so many junior employees could be included because it increased visibility. However, as it turns out, after the meetings were over, most junior people had no idea what the meeting was actually about, even though they were there or they had watched a recording. Now, this is because they didn't have the chance to chat with their manager after the fact about what the meeting meant. They didn't hear their managers talk about the meeting in a team room or in an Uber, as they would have pre-pandemic. So junior people missed out on what the meeting meant and therefore couldn't learn from it. This example relates to the importance of sense making during and after meetings to ensure everyone is on the same page. This research specifically speaks to the importance of intentional record keeping. Writing down what was said word for word is not as important as writing down what was meant and who should do what next and when. So as Dave is going to talk about more, MITRE directly tackles our fear of meeting amnesia and over-reliance on detailed recordings and transcripts by capturing high-level summaries and allowing participants to record who needs to do what in real time during the meeting. So there's a lot of myths around meetings, and this list, even though it's long, is just a partial one. And MITRE, as an early stage startup, has only begun tackling a few of these myths. And we're uncovering more myths as we talk to users and do more research. So as we expand and evolve the product, we'll have the chance to go deeper on the myths we've started addressing and to tackle more of them in order to help people plan for and run more successful meetings.
Thank you, Ashley. So how do we turn all of that behavioral insight into a product? We've uncovered problems rooted in cognitive biases. We can find solutions there too. Here are some of the behavioral science tools we've turned to in designing and refining our product. The big concepts here on the left side come from the book Nudge, which you've probably heard of, by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which is the best roadmap I'm aware of for how to apply behavioral science to product design. But I've drawn from other resources here too. Let me walk you through a few of these, starting with libertarian paternalism. It's a philosophy for how we influence users in an ethical way. It might sound a bit scary in the current US political climate, but it's not. Paternalism says, let's acknowledge that people aren't rational actors. They're loaded with cognitive biases that may work against their best interests. So let's find ways to push them in the right direction. But who decides what's the right direction? Basically, we want them to do whatever their future selves will be glad that they did. So it's okay if they don't really want to plan a meeting and we somehow entice them to do it anyway, as long as later they'll say, okay, I planned a meeting and I feel really good about it. Libertarian says it's not cool to force or coerce people into doing something. They should still have a choice, an out. So we're encouraging a particular behavior, but if you really don't want to do it, okay, that's fine, you don't have to. Choice architecture is a kind of an umbrella concept for how we design around that. So every product anyone designs boils down to presenting a set of choices. How we offer those choices can have a profound impact on what people choose. So let's be deliberate about it. Which brings us to nudges. This is basically how we apply choice architecture to individual moments in a design. When we say we nudge someone, we mean we structure their choices in such a way that they're more likely to choose a particular option while still giving them the ability to make another choice if they want to. I'll get into some of the concepts on the right in the context of talking about MITRE itself. Speaking of which, this is MITRE. I don't want to turn this thing into an infomercial, but to give you a quick bit of context, we're a product you can use on the web, in your calendar, or in your Zoom meetings. Before the meeting, we help you prep. During the meeting, we give you collaborative note-taking, the ability to capture outcomes in real time, and facilitation on demand. And then after the meeting, we compile and send out a summary like Ashley was talking about, and we collect your action items for you so you can get back to them later. You can use MITRE today by going to mitre.co, and I hope you will. I hope you'll give it a shot and send us some feedback. For today, I'm going to focus on two aspects of our product, the goal nudge and the summary. The goal nudge was our first real nudge that we built. The purpose or the goal of a meeting sits at the center of our product strategy at MITRE. We know agendas don't work, but in addition to the biases Ashley talked about, our reading and research have led us to the conclusion that when agendas do work, it's because they define the purpose of a meeting and get people aligned around it. We also think it's important for the goal to be outcome oriented, so you're thinking about the impact of a meeting when you're planning it. That in itself is a form of framing, which is one of the concepts I listed on the last slide. Framing is part of a cluster of cognitive biases and techniques rooted in how powerfully people respond to narrative. When we design products, we're telling users a story about reality, about our product, and about the user themselves. Framing is how we tell that story, how we provide context. As a simple example, on Tuesdays, my wife and I go out for dinner. We call it date night. We could also call it nobody wants to cook night, which is a different framing. And how we frame it probably influences what we do and how we do it. In this case, if I ask, what's the goal of this meeting? It's a different framing from, what do you want to achieve in this meeting? And you'd expect it to affect the kind of answers we get. And indeed, we've done some research here, and that's exactly what happens. When you frame the goal in terms of outcomes, the answers get more specific. On the left on this slide is our first stab at a goal nudge. We showed it in Google Calendar whenever you created a meeting. This was early last year, so we didn't have enough users to get really robust results, but we did not see people using it. And our hypothesis was, and still is, that we were asking the question at the wrong time. One user said she kind of resented the question because she felt obligated to answer it, but didn't want to deal with it right then. Add to that the fact that we know people are sometimes scheduling stuff on the fly as part of real-time coordination, interrupting another conversation. So like, oh, hey, how about 2 p.m. on Tuesday? No, that's not going to work. Can you do 2:30? Yeah, sure. Okay, I sent you an invite, and then getting back to the other conversation. So it makes sense they wouldn't want to pause and think about goals at that point. So our lesson here was about timing nudges. A nudge happens in a particular moment, and how successful it is can depend on picking the right moment. That is, choice architecture is about when as well as what. On the right, you'll see our product today. A few things have changed. First, the placeholder for an empty goal says, meeting has no goal, which makes me smile because it feels like the right kind of nudge to me, and it's a little mischievous. Again, it boils down to framing. If I say, type your goal here, sure, it's an invitation to do something, but it's fine if you don't. But meeting has no goal, that's a challenge because nobody wants to have a pointless meeting. I also think there's a cognitive bias at work here, maybe a variant of loss aversion. If you see something and it feels wrong, I think you'll be more motivated to fix it than if you see something that it's missing. We've also replaced the freeform input with a set of choices that are heavily influenced by some of Ashley's research into what the different types of meeting actually are. These choices are all about reducing friction. There's the mechanical reduction in keystrokes and clicks, yeah. But even more importantly, we're reducing cognitive load. You don't have to think too hard to fill in a goal. You just pick one. There's maybe also a little bit of default bias going on here. Default bias is people's strong tendency to go with the default option when one is provided. So one famous example you've probably heard of is organ donation. There are significant differences from country to country in the rate of people signing up to be organ donors. And the main reason is simply which countries make it the default option on the relevant form. Here, we're giving you a set of outcome-oriented options that taken together serve as a default, with the final other as the non-default. The numbers here are promising, as many users click on the goal field as start a meeting, which is great, but we think we can do better. Earlier, I talked about finding the right moment for this nudge. Our current moment is a good one, but it's diffuse. In a sense, it's any time you're looking at the meeting or whenever you feel like it, which might be never. So one thing we can do is pick a more explicit moment. The mock-up in the center here imagines that when you first open a meeting, we highlight the goal while dimming everything else. It's a stronger nudge, but it is still a nudge since you can click out of it. There's definitely greater risk of annoying people, either because they don't want to put in a goal at all or because they want a different moment. But there are a lot of permutations we can try and a lot of room to experiment. So directionally, I think it's a good path, even if the details end up changing. We've also set ourselves up for success here by narrowing the scope of the nudge. Looking at our data a while back, we built a list of things that appear in people's calendars that might not deserve a goal, like gym time or doctor appointment, and we exempt those completely from the goal nudge. Another thing we can do is find additional moments to nudge people. Even if creation time in the calendar was the wrong moment, what about right after creation, or the beginning of your day, or the beginning of your week? So that's the goal nudge. MITRE's summary feature tackles a number of the myths Ashley talked about earlier. And it also serves a go-to-market role that Damien will talk about in a minute. I'll take a moment to walk you through what you're seeing in the screenshots here. After a meeting ends, MITRE provides this summary to you. For each topic in your meeting, you'll see decisions, action items, and starred notes that you marked during the meeting. The summary gives you access to all the notes from your meeting, but highlights these outcomes at the top. So in the Gmail screenshot here, you can see there was a topic called Updates from Everyone, with an action item to do competitive analysis and a starred note about making this a priority for Q4. Our summary uses a behavioral concept from my list earlier called destination postcards. This term was coined, as far as I know, by Dan and Chip Heath in their book Switch, but it's supported by some other research too. So say I want to motivate you to do something. Your future self will appreciate it, but your current self isn't really all that psyched about it. So I show you a postcard from the future. I make it real. I bring it more into the present so it helps motivate you. It's another example of how we can use narrative in our product design. When you get a MITRE summary for somebody else's meeting, sure, it's got a bunch of utility in terms of reminding you what happened in the meeting, but we're doing something more. We're showing you a postcard. It's a picture of future you as a MITRE user who sends useful summaries to other people. The summary says, this could be you sending out this kick-ass summary that actually makes the meeting feel productive and useful. And even if you're already a MITRE user, every time you get a summary for one of your own meetings, it's a reminder of why future you should keep using MITRE. Excuse me. Of course, we have to deliver on the utility part of the summary. Ashley talked about the importance of sense making after meetings, and that's closely related to alignment. Without it, a bunch of people can walk out of a meeting with different ideas of what's going on. We believe this can't just happen after the meeting, especially with remote and hybrid meetings. Even with in-person meetings, yeah, people can chat and make sense of things as they leave the room, and that's good when it happens for the people who do it, but it doesn't help anyone else, and people forget things over time. Again, this is about finding the right moment. If you have to make sense of things in writing after the meeting, it's not going to happen reliably because of another cognitive bias, hyperbolic discounting, which describes how people overvalue the present moment at the expense of the future. In this case, your current self doesn't value writing down the summary, which you already know, to benefit your future self who's forgotten it all. So we built sense making into our note-taking experience, so you're doing it during the meeting as you go, as part of the actual meeting process. Note-taking in MITRE is designed to look and feel like a chat. We wanted to create a familiar environment in which anyone would feel comfortable contributing a note and thus being part of the group making sense of things. Contributing a note is useful on its own, but there's also an opportunity for the group to take it farther, like, oh, Dave, what did you mean by that note there? I'm not sure I agree. I was thinking this other thing. That type of discussion also drives alignment. And then the next and even more important step is capturing outcomes in real time. We make it really, really easy to mark something as a decision or an action item while you're taking notes, and then that earmarks it so it will appear in the summary. So then the summary itself is the culmination and the record of all that sense making that happened during the meeting. So sense making is one way we use the summary. Ashley also talked about the idea of meeting FOMO, that fear of missing out, of not mattering if you're not in the room. And as she said, the summary helps with that. Hey, person who wasn't in the room, here's a summary, so you're part of the process. You're in the loop. And oh, by the way, I value you enough that I didn't waste your time with this hour of discussion. Again, that's a question of framing. But the summary is just the beginning with this one. We've got a plan for a subscriptions feature that creates a whole feedback loop, including the summary, and maybe piggybacking on the idea of optional attendees in your calendar. So now I can invite you to a meeting as a subscriber, which means you know you'll be prompted for input ahead of time and get the summary after. And even just having your name on the invite is probably going to feel validating. From a choice architecture standpoint, we're basically introducing a new choice that didn't exist before. Framing it as part of the meeting itself is choice architecture too. You're not deciding whether to participate in the meeting. You're just choosing how you want to participate. We can look at making subscribing the default, or more likely we can let a meeting organizer make the initial choice and frame it as a recommendation to the participant, which could then help them feel empowered rather than left out. Summary is a perfect segue into talking about our go-to-market strategy. With a behavior change product, it's especially important to have marketing and product in lockstep because there isn't a hard line where one ends and the other begins. That postcard from the future, it's both. So I'll hand it over to Damien to talk about that.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, why do we need to think of go-to-market as an integral part of the psychology of product design, as Dave mentioned? You know, as Ashley and Dave have outlined, meetings aren't just an individual problem, right? They're an organizational problem. MITRE has to be widely used throughout the organization to have a material impact on the meeting culture. And, you know, I'll emphasize here used, right? We've all seen things that you purchase and then never log into, but to really create that behavior change that we want to see in the organization, it does actually have to be used by the team. And so, you know, designing a product like MITRE, it's not enough to think about the psychology of the individual. We also have to look at the group dynamics. To highlight the scope of this challenge, I'll talk a little bit more about a traditional type of software that also tracks the outcomes of meetings, the customer relationship management system, or CRM. This is the class of tools that tracks all the work that a sales organization does to bring on new customers and retain existing ones. You've probably heard of Salesforce, right? Even if you're not super familiar with the category, these are basically the tools that track deal information and all the customer communications inside and outside the organization. So, you know, why does such a system exist? Where's that psychological imperative? You might think that the primary purpose is to be a convenient tool where, you know, the sales teams can keep track of all their work. I I've been a sales leader for over a decade, and I can tell you that salespeople actively hate these tools and resist their use even when it improves their work. It's a real struggle to get them to put their deals into the system and keep all that data up to date. And there's really two biases at work here. The friction cost of the data entry, which, for sales reps is basically the worst thing ever. And there's a real hyperbolic discounting effect here where, sure, the future self of that sales rep really would like to have, the up-to-date information about where things are, but the current sales rep really needs to hop onto that next call. Sales reps, just like everyone else, as Ashley mentioned, have that sort of time poverty within the organization sort of problem as well. And, so think about everything that goes into that. That's a real uphill battle. The only reason that a CRM actually exists and is a system that is used at all is there's this really strong countervailing force, which is every week, the CRO, the CEO, and the CFO want to be able to look at one report that tells them whether or not they're going to hit their goals for the quarter. So here suddenly there's very little discounting, right? The executive's focus is on the future. It's very important to them. And they are the ones who are in the position to drive that organizational usage. So the CRM is actually swimming upstream against the default behavior of the salesperson, ostensibly the core user of that system, right? And, I'm going to belabor the point here because, the CRM costs are huge. And it's really that same ground that MITRE as a product needs to tread without some of the infrastructure around it that I'm about to describe. So even making a CRM available to the sales team is a pretty complicated process. Someone from sales leadership will reach out to some vendors. Could be a pretty protracted buying process. Implementation can take 3 months, 6 months. Some of these systems are very elaborate. Usually there's a short training for the sales org that kind of gets swept under the rug a little bit. But, suddenly there you go. Everyone has their login emails and you've barely even started racking up the cost. That's maybe 10% of the effort of getting someone into the system and using it, that distribution piece. So, because as we mentioned, getting the sales reps to log into the tool, put their information into it on a regular basis requires a pretty elaborate series of carrot and sticks to get it to happen. So the first thing that will happen is the CRM is now where the sales reps are presented with their leads, those potential conversations they can have with new customers, which is one of the things they want most of all. So at least you have the sales reps logging in on a regular basis. The other thing that's going to happen is now the CRM is where the sales rep gets credit for the deals that they close. In other words, that's how they get paid. And so every one of these systems is set up to require a bare minimum of information to ensure that you can say, yep, send me my check, it's all good. A really common refrain in a sales organization is if it's not in the CRM, it didn't happen. But as you can imagine, that's a pretty big gap between the minimal usage that we're seeing here and the data that powers all those reports that ultimately filter up to the executive level. And that's bridged by what I affectionately call nagging, which is where, the sales manager on a weekly or towards the end of the quarter, probably a daily basis, if not hourly, goes through this just really horrible, painful process of asking every single rep on the team, why is this deal not in the system? Where's the update on this? Why hasn't the number changed? What's happening here? Right. And there's just this very intensive one-on-one personal sort of set of work to keep that system up to date. And what I outlined here, it's an incredible amount of time and effort and money. And the only way that the CRM gets away with being so at odds with the psychology of its user base is because that outside force, the executive pressure downward is what keeps that all glued together and keeps the usage of the system going. So, let's talk about MITRE, right? We still need to drive that distribution. We still need that usage, but we don't have any of those people lined up to do the work within the organization that we're trying to change that I just outlined, the sales managers and the C-suite people, right? Just as with the CRM example, there is a huge amount of potential value to be unleashed, reducing meeting times, boosting efficiency and employee happiness. And I mean, improving overall decision-making coordination within the organization can be huge, right? There's a lot of value there, but there's a real diffusion of responsibility going on. There's no one whose job it is to make everyone's meetings better, right? There's no chief meetings officer. And even in organizations which are incredibly, with incredibly forward-looking leaders, top-down behavior change like this is just tough, right? So imagine what type of effort it would take for HR to supply a facilitator to every single meeting on every single person's calendar to introduce a new meeting process and to make sure it was being followed. And you get kind of a sense for the amount of work and effort that we're talking about here. So what that means is that MITRE has to do all of the work done by the various groups in our CRM example. So as a core part of the product design, MITRE has to do all that distribution itself, right? That diffusion of responsibility effect, given that there's no chief meeting officer, means that we need to appeal to new users right at the individual level as a product, right? And then MITRE also has to advocate for its own usage once we have that user. So we can't afford the friction costs that I outlined with the CRM. The act of using the product, essentially that data entry that really bedevils the CRM, it has to feel valuable and important in its own right. So essentially the product itself has to take the place of that sales manager in the CRM example and promote its own use. So, all of that really goes hand in hand with what Dave and Ashley were talking about, which is to really realize the behavior change we need to see in the organization. MITRE's distribution and retention has to be built into the product from the start. So, all those features like the summary actually serve a dual purpose. They're a great experience, right? So the individual user gets this receipt of the work they did about what happened in the meeting so that they don't forget about it, right? That's a core value that we're providing the user. And also, we're promoting group usage because we're providing value to people who aren't even MITRE users yet, so we can distribute it to them and they can become part of the system as well. Because remember, we can't rely on the outside forces that I outlined in the CRM example to do that, right? MITRE has to do it for itself.
So, and then kind of building on what Damian was talking about there, it's often convenient for us to compare a product like MITRE to fitness trackers like Fitbit or Apple Watch. They've done a great job motivating people to overcome the inertia of their current selves to achieve longer-term fitness goals. But there's a difference. And it again goes back to what Damian's really talking about. People know they need to exercise. And while everyone hates meetings, it's possible to blame other people or dismiss fixing meetings as impossible. Maybe you think other people's meetings suck, but surely yours are great. Or maybe you think meetings in general suck and there's nothing to be done about it. We've encountered both of those attitudes in our research. So after we do the stuff we've been talking about here, this might be our next frontier. We're starting with people who recognize they could run better meetings, and thankfully they exist. But we want to do more. We want to change not just people's behavior, but their motivation to connect their hatred for meetings to their agency in fixing the problem, to convince them this is achievable and within their power. And I do think the answer lies in the same kinds of techniques we've been talking about here, as well as in cognitive biases we haven't brought up yet, like optimism bias or the fundamental attribution error or confirmation bias. It's going to be a challenge. And that's what's exciting about working on this stuff on a good day and frustrating on a bad one. This is still relatively new territory for product design, and we're figuring it out as we go, which mostly I think is fun. So that's all we got. I'd love to hear thoughts and questions. I see there's already a bunch in the Zoom Q&A. I don't know how we want to field those. I've put our contact info on this slide and may take it down so you can see our faces after a couple of minutes. I hope you contact us. I'd love to hear from you. I think we all would. I will mention briefly, I'm out of the office next week. So if you email me and you don't hear back right away, don't take it personally.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Dave. Big thank you to all of the presenters, to Dr. Ashley Whillans, to Dave Feldman, and to Damian Wisniewski, and big apologies to mispronouncing all of those names at the beginning. I'm going to blame it on a Friday. But huge thank you. That was fascinating. I personally definitely subscribe to my meetings don't suck, but everyone else's do. So I'm sure I learned a lot from this presentation. So we already have some questions in the chat. I'm going to take this opportunity to mispronounce more names and call on some folks who had some really good questions in the chat. Please also raise your hand if you want to ask a question to kind of get in the queue. If for any reason you do not want to or do not feel comfortable answering your question or asking your question out loud, no problem. Just you can feel free to type it as well. So I'm going to start by calling on Brett Enzer, and I'm going to allow you to unmute. Okay, Brett, ask away. You had a great question in the chat.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. This was super interesting. I was struck by the meaning making idea, and I think I know the answer now that I watched the entire presentation. Magical how that happens. But just to circle back, it sounded like rather than the verbatim note taking, which there's a tendency and compulsion to do, that one of the advantages of MITRE is to raise that up a level to what was meant, or in what the meaning of particular topics were or are. But it struck me that that's often depending on the listener. Depending if I'm from engineering, something has particular meaning. If I'm from sales, it has another meaning. So how do you accommodate different interpretations of particular decisions, statements, shares, so on and so forth?
I can probably take that one. Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and it kind of sits at the heart of exactly what we're trying to do that you just described very well. By making the notes and the outcomes public in real time, we're giving people the opportunity to resolve those differences and to start with, to make those differences plain, right? So if I'm an engineer and I put in the notes that I think we're going to do something, and you're a product manager, you're a marketer, and your perspective, maybe just owing to the fact that you're coming from a different role, is different, that's an opportunity that isn't like after the meeting, that isn't just the two of us one-on-one, for you to say, that's not how I heard it, or that's not what I think we should do even, and you're jumping to conclusions there, Dave. And then that conversation can happen during the meeting, and we can revise the notes or amend the notes accordingly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I think it's even in the status quo, it's a fraught situation, because if I mean, I've personally been in a situation, the scenario where notes verbatim were taken and multiple folks are reading them, and there's a need for clarification because they're trying to interpret the meaning of, or the implication of, the decision, share, whatever.
Yeah.
So I like the collaborative approach to meaning making.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, great. Next, we had a question that got a lot of upvotes in the chat from Dave. Dave, I'm going to allow you to unmute, and if you feel comfortable asking your question, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I am not in products, and so I was wondering if any or the three of you had a different perspective than I do, where outside of a professional setting where behavioral science input or insights are already accepted, do you have you had the experience where post fact the insights themselves actually, I think I got muted halfway through that.
Sorry. Yep. Go for it, Dave.
So I believe where I was do you have the experience where after the fact where the insights have been revealed where they seem a little bit too obvious and then they're either dismissed or they don't carry the weight that they should in terms of how much actual behavior change they will bring, because you're talking about something that maybe people feel like they're familiar with because they've also had, you know, human interactions in their lives. So to them it just makes sense, but because of the way that it comes out or because of their familiarity with general human behavior after you've explained what's happening, that it doesn't really carry that same value.
I mean, I think, you know, it's the thing about behavior change is that I think the less you talk about it, the better. You know, it's basically, you know, showing people behind the curtain and, you know, talking the trick doesn't really do the thing as well as just providing an experience where people are like, you know, just do it because it feels natural. And I'll give, you know, there's sort of an example that, like, I don't know how to make this change in the world, but, you know, we see a lot of companies out there that love to show metrics that are easy to measure. So for example, they will show, you know, in this meeting, men talked 75% of the time and women talk 25% of the time, like very common, right? This is a great meeting because it was like 1/3, 2/3. But, you know, I mean, it's like, you know, you can put that metric up on the screen until the cows come home, right? And it doesn't move the needle. It just, you know, it just sort of shows what's happening, but then it doesn't inspire the change that you want to see in the world. So, you know, talking about it and the changing of the behavior, I think of as being two different things.
I like to call that problem the okay, but let me finish problem. I'll add a couple of things. I don't know that we've ever explicitly heard the thing you're concerned about, but it keeps me up at night because, you know, I spent 5-6 minutes talking about all of the nuances of our goal nudge and the ways in which we're going to keep iterating on it. But like, you look at it and you're seeing things through like a computer sciencey algorithmic lens. You're like, Dave, why should I care about this? It's a drop down with 7 options in it. I could build that in 5 minutes, right? So I'm sensitive about that because there's so much thought that goes into what we build, but it isn't necessarily evident if you're just looking at it. The interesting thing is we also get the other problem, like when we're talking to, you know, partners, prospective investors, whatever, where they're like, I don't know why I need this. I have a coded doc that's tied into a Notion doc, and we have this big template, and like we have a system. And I want to ask, but I also want to be polite. Yeah, but did you stop and question why you were having the meeting? Because that's probably more important. But like, it goes back to a lot of the stuff Ashley was talking about in terms of like, you know, feeling busy, maximizing measured mediums, all of that. Like, I'm doing all this work, and so my meetings must be great. Well, maybe.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
Super. Okay, so we have another question in the chat from Sunkyu Philip Kwan. I'll allow you to speak, Sunkyu. If you do want to ask your question, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, I'll read it out. You there, Sunkyu? Sunkyu? Okay, I will read Sunkyu's question, which is, regarding notes and summary, why don't you just call the benefits to it countering forgetting or retroactive interference?
I think we've talked a little bit about this, but it's really important, like the sense making element, like it's more than just remembering what happened, but trying to like create a sense of alignment on what the meeting meant and who needs to do what, and resolving any of these discrepancies, as Dave was already talking about. And then I think we focus on meeting amnesia because it's catchy. Like there's no like real like term in terms, it's just like something that's sticky as we're writing about this topic, and it resonates with people. Like the fear that you just like end up in a meeting where you know that you've kind of had this meeting before but you literally don't remember anything about the last meeting. Like as we're having discussions about this research, I was like, oh yeah, that's like you know, every meeting with a PhD student where I'm like, we used to joke with senior colleague, like one of my senior colleagues used to joke that, and this is really hard, but they would be like, can you just start at the beginning? Like, remind me, like, you know, the thesis topic and that you're studying, and then ask me the very specific question about this very specific study. Like, can you just start at hello, my name is, because like people are in so many meetings. And so, I mean, there is this real fear that we just are going to end up at a meeting and be completely completely blank on like the context. And so I think amnesia really is like, has that like feel, like this emotional or provocative feel that all of us have had, like that pit in your stomach when you're like in a meeting and you think you should remember context that you don't. And then people are really motivated to overcome that feeling. So I think that's where the idea of meeting amnesia comes from. But the solution in the product is more than just helping people remember what happened, but it's helping everyone get aligned on what needs to happen next, and making sure we are on the same page about what are the clear takeaways from that meeting.
There is a piece, I'm stealing a story of Damien's because he's typing an answer right now, but there is a piece that we like to talk about sometimes where that I think does tie into the direct answer to your question as well, which is, yeah, there's forgetting. And it can be really severe in situations where like you're in a quarterly business review and maybe you're not the most powerful person in the room, which is most of us. And the person who's the powerful person in the room is like, what happened in the middle of August where the numbers tanked? And they're looking straight at you and you're terrified. And then you can imagine you could go to a MITRE summary and say, no, look, we made this decision together. You signed off on it, Mr. Powerful Person or Ms. Powerful Person. And we knew it was going to tank the numbers and we made the trade-off, and like, it's all right here. So there is that piece of it too, but we think maybe that's running, whereas getting the sense making going is walking first.
Yeah, great. That makes a lot of sense. We do have a question in the chat around sort of the noisiness of taking notes. And someone mentioned that they lose 10 minutes taking notes, have no idea where the meeting is. Any ways that MITRE is solving for that?
Biggest would just be trying to encourage people to do it collaboratively and make it easy and quick. I don't think it's challenging. I mean, we are asking people, if you believe that a transcript would be enough, we're asking you to do more work. And so that's a challenge for us, but we think it's important work. The more that load can be shared, the easier it is to type a note, the less you have to get distracted from the work of doing the meeting in the process. And we do have some ideas for reducing that effort even further over time, and hopefully we get there.
Okay, great. We've just got a few minutes left. I know Natalie had her hand up for quite a while. Natalie, it looks like Natalie just had to sign off, unfortunately. Hopefully she'll reach out to you directly. Dan Coleman, maybe do you want to ask the last question, since you've got a question here in the chat that a lot of people also want to answer? Feel free to unmute if you're able and willing.
Hi, thanks for the really provocative, fascinating set of ideas and how they land in a real product. It's really exciting stuff. I had two questions in there. The big one was like to put an extra dare out to you, which was, could you even reshape the really disturbing addiction we have to demonstrating our worth by, how long our agenda might be. There should be a phrase for that wouldn't be too much of an innuendo. But the other question that I would really love your help with was, have you found any great questions to ask that really prompt people to make sense? Because that does sound like one of the hardest things you guys are getting at is, how do you help people, whether individually or as a group, make sense of what just happened and figure out, how do you turn it into what we call a takeaway?
That's a fascinating question. Yeah, it ties a little bit into a feature we just launched called Dynamics, which helps people facilitate, it actually does some of the facilitation work in real time. The sense making, well, we want it to happen in real time as well. So it makes me wonder, is there something along those lines or even as part of that feature that we can ask people that are general enough questions to make sense of things together. I mean, some ideas are occurring to me. I don't know that we want to turn this into a design brainstorm with, not much time left, but I love the question. So, I hope that's a satisfying answer that I'm going to think about it offline and maybe we'll come up with something.
I also love, I also love the idea of tracking productivity via, contributions to sense making or like a number, because people, I teach a motivation and incentives class and people do what they're, rewarded for. And so how can we shift the rewards away from meetings attended or transcripts sent to other things within meetings that we know drive efficiency outcomes?
You made 73 cents this week.
That meeting cost.
We can put it on the blockchain and then it'll just all work.
Oh boy.
Every time in a bad meeting, I just think about how much that meeting is costing. Great. Well, we are at time. Fantastic questions, everyone. We wish we had more time for questions. I know that there are a lot of questions in the chat. So if our panelists are open to it, we'll look to send those questions along to them and then just collate some answers and send them out to the folks who attended, which we really appreciate. And you can see the contact information on the screen here for Dave, Ashley, and Damien. Encourage you to reach out to them with any questions. Of course,
please
reach out to Irrational Labs as well for any questions from us, and really appreciate the almost 300 people who attended at some points of today's lecture, especially, as I said, on a Friday. We're impressed with your nerdiness and your willingness to make meetings suck last. So thank you again to all of our panelists today. This was a fascinating lecture, and we will send out the recording and post it on our YouTube channel as well. So you can watch it again and again and force your colleagues who didn't attend to learn some things as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.